On May 18, 1889, a boy was born in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and they named him Thomas. This boy would later become an important figure in the world, Thomas Midgley. Don't think he's super famous like Thomas Edison though, not everyone knows him. He's famous for a very specific reason. Thomas Midgley's family was full of engineers, inventors, and innovators. For example, his father worked in the lab of a tire company, spending all day researching ways to improve tires. See that handsaw? It was invented by Thomas's maternal grandfather, James Emerson. That's why their family was wealthy. Much of their fortune came from this invention. Thomas grew up, continued his education, and went on to study mechanical engineering at Cornell University. 4 years later, he graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. During the American Industrial Revolution, some cities were major industrial hubs. The biggest one was Detroit, where Henry Ford thrived, and the second largest industrial city was Dayton, Ohio. After getting his mechanical engineering degree, Thomas had to move to one of these cities to find a good job. He landed a position in a lab for General Motors in Dayton, Ohio. GM gave him a specific mission: find a solution to get rid of engine knock. Engine knock happens when the engine isn't running properly. Basically, the fuel and air mixture isn't well coordinated. When this happens, the engine runs poorly, consumes more fuel, creates more pollution, and most importantly for that time, it makes a lot of noise and causes vibrations. Thomas Midgley started working in the lab to find a solution to this problem. Not only he was a mechanical engineer, but also had a good grasp of chemistry, thanks to his family's background in science. He kicked off his work by placing a periodic table on his desk and saying, one by one, we're going to test these elements with gasoline to see if we can fix this problem. For 10 years, he tried all sorts of experiments without success until 1921. That year, he mixed an element with gasoline that finally solved the engine knock issue. And what was that element? Lead. When Thomas mixed lead with gasoline, he noticed that after running the engine for a long time, some lead residue would stay inside the engine cylinders, which wasn't good for the engine. Then, during his experiments, he mixed ethylene bromide with lead and saw that everything worked perfectly. The lead no longer stayed inside the cylinders and was easily expelled through the exhaust. He was thrilled that he had finally solved the problem, but little did he know what consequences this would have for the world. When General Motors realized that Thomas had developed a type of gasoline that made engines run smoothly without any engine knock, they praised him and started selling the fuel under their own packaging. This packaging was labeled anti-knock compound. General Motors knew that lead was toxic and people were somewhat aware of it too, so when they sold this gasoline, they made sure not to mention anything about lead, nor did they write it on the packaging. They simply labeled it ethyl. A factory was set up to produce this leaded gasoline, and in the very first month, 8 workers died from lead poisoning. However, no one seemed to care or pay attention to these issues. As a result, not only did leaded gasoline become widespread across the US, but eventually it spread around the world. Eventually, the truth had to come out, but since people's cars were running much better, they were mostly satisfied and didn't mind. At this point, Thomas Midgley was only 30 years old, but he had already made one of the biggest inventions of the time and was eager to invent more. A year after the global success of leaded gasoline, Thomas decided to invent a gas that would revolutionize refrigerator production. Once again, he pulled out the periodic table, placed it on his desk, and said, one by one, I'm going to mix these elements to create an efficient cooling gas. Interestingly, the gas he invented was named Freon, a name still used today for refrigerants. Thomas tirelessly mixed different elements until he created a cooling gas. After 5 years of experimentation, he finally succeeded. He produced a gas with the formula composed of 3 elements: carbon, chlorine, and fluorine. He named this gas Freon 12, which later became known as R12. Thomas had now managed to make both car engines run smoothly and helped refrigerators become mass-produced and enter homes. Of course, at that time, cars didn't yet have air conditioning systems. Thomas Midgley made 2 major inventions that impacted the world. While these inventions later caused significant problems, at that time they were considered groundbreaking. Sadly, Thomas didn't live long. He passed away at the age of 55 from polio, which you know as childhood paralysis. For 30 years after Midgley's death, his inventions continued to be widely used around the world, but in the mid-1970s, scientists started looking at poisoning statistics and noticed an alarming amount of lead in people's bodies, especially in crowded, large cities. The scientists realized that the lead in gasoline was poisoning people, not only affecting older adults but also lowering children's intelligence. This news spread like wildfire across the world, but companies with a stake in leaded gasoline launched propaganda efforts. They worked hard to discredit the scientists, telling the public that these concerns were just nonsense and convincing people it wasn't something to worry about. For another 5 years, these debates raged on until finally in the 1980s, the US became the first country in the world to make leaded gasoline illegal. 40 years have passed since then, and while gasoline is now lead-free, gas stations in the US still label their fuel as unleaded. After the US ban, other countries followed suit, removing lead from their gasoline one by one. However, it took more than 60 years from Thomas Midgley's invention in 1922 until gasoline became fully lead-free worldwide. Scientists estimate that over those 6 decades, more than 100 million people globally died from lead poisoning. At the same time, Midgley's other invention, R12, was being used in cooling systems all around the world, in refrigerators, air conditioners, car ACs, and any other cooling device. In 1974, for the first time, a group of scientists in the US discovered that R12 gas had a severely negative impact on the ozone layer. At that time, the scientists warned that the gas was thinning the ozone layer, allowing harmful UV rays from the sun to reach us, leading to increased skin cancer. However, no one paid attention. 12 years later, in 1986, scientists realized that the ozone layer above the South Pole had significantly thinned and was getting thinner by the day. Less than a year after this discovery, in September 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed. This treaty is significant because it was the first and only time that all the countries in the world united for a common cause. In the Montreal Protocol, nations committed to phasing out R12 from all cooling systems by 1989. By 2015, tests showed that the ozone layer was beginning to heal itself. There have been many inventors throughout history who made various inventions. Thomas Midgley also had multiple patents, but 2 of his most famous inventions set global records. One of his inventions poisoned and killed over 100 million people, and the other punched a hole in the ozone layer. He was trying to find solutions, but his inventions ended up having unintended consequences. Now the question is Thomas Midgley responsible for the deaths of those 100 million people or not? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel.